Good to see some familiar names amongst the list of attendees. So I think, as we all know, we are heading for an important health bill, which is coming up, probably going to be introduced, announced in the Queen's speech, probably introduced sometime next month. So the focus of the session really is what's being proposed and what should we be asking for. So hopefully we've got a good combination of speakers so that we can get a good debate going. So hello, my name is Chris Hopson. I'm Chief Executive of NHS Providers. As you might imagine, we're doing a lot of work on the bill. We've got Dr. Jason Yiannikkou, who is Director of the Bill team of the department. We have a legal view from Michael Rourke, who's a partner at Hempsons. And we've got our old chair, but now the independent chair of Gloucestershire ICS, Dame Jill Morgan. So what we're going to do is we're just going to ask Jason, Michael and Jill in that order to just give us a sense of what their view is of the bill. So Jason, as you would expect, will set out more, to be frank, given where we are in the process, what was in the white paper. It would be inappropriate to ask him to be too extensive on what actually might be in the bill compared to the white paper, and getting him to do a detailed forensic analysis of the difference between the two wouldn't quite be right. So he'll give you a sense about the white paper, and then, as I said, we'll come on to Michael and Jill. So Jason, give us a sense of what it looks like from your perspective.
Brilliant. Thanks, Chris. And thanks, everyone. It's good to be with you, if not here. The word never has the word here been stranger than it has been in this last year or so. But it's lovely to join you anyway. I'm going to say a little. I was sort of working out what to say, and one of the headings that I jotted down was the story so far, and I'm going to say a little bit about the story so far because I think there's at least two stories that are relevant to that sort of title, probably more. We may even get into a bit of a discussion about that, and they sort of intertwine a bit, and that may be a bit of a theme for today. So one story we can definitely tell about how we've got to sort of this moment, as Chris says, between the Queen's speech and the introduction of the legislation, is a sort of policy legislation type story of a fairly familiar kind. So it begins, I guess, with the long-term plan and the proposals that came from that from NHS England back in 2019, which does seem, quite a long time ago. And of course, in the interim period, quite a lot has happened. There was quite a lot that happened in the world of government and politics, and quite a lot that has happened in the world of health and care and society ever since with the pandemic. And so the gap between that initial sort of moment when the proposals came forward, most of which, I think all of which really have lived on into the final sort of product, and now is quite a long one compared to the sort of usual process. And so that's one sort of story, if you like, but intertwined with that and alongside that, there's another story, if you like. That was story one, and this is story two. And this is a bit different, I suppose, to the usual way in which legislation manifests itself. So this is the story of principally ICSs, but also other ways of sort of adapting within the current legal framework that have given us a sort of strong indication of the sorts of things that we should take forward and formalise in legislation. And that second story, the story of sort of, kind of pragmatic arrangements, experimentation, innovation, partnership, and so on, that I think Jill in particular will say more about, is the important story in all of this. It's the thing that justifies story one. It's the reason we want to do story one, and story one should be in service of story two, if you like. And I sort of labour this point a little bit because, of course, very often it's that first story that tends to get privileged over the second story in the way that these things are debated and looked at. And what we've tried to do in the way we've developed the policy, the way we've engaged with people, and the way we've framed the proposals into legislation, which obviously, as Chris said, I can't really say anything about when that will happen, but you will see them at some point. You will be able to test whether or not we've been able to follow that through. And I think the the watchword for us, and I'll say a little bit about what's in the white paper and give you a sense of the policy sort of breadth of the legislation. But the sort of the thread that runs through it is, I think, flexibility and adaptability at different levels of the system. I think that's one of the deep lessons that we've learned over recent years. It's also, I think, been reinforced by the experience of the pandemic. And in a legislative context, when you try and bring forward a flexible, relatively permissive approach to things, we will find, I'm sure, that there will be interest in possibly trying to pin down some of what we are trying to do, make it more specific, make it more categorical in one way or another, often quite understandably, and that will obviously play through the parliamentary process. And that is why story 2, the story of kind of the real world implementation of this on a non-statutory basis prior to the legislation is so important for us as well as for you, I think, because we need to be able to tell that story well to explain why having a strong degree of flexibility and adaptability in the system is going to be important and will work well. So I think there's a sort of an important point of alignment and overlap there, and that's why we've tried to stay close to colleagues in the NHS and in NHS England in developing the proposals and in talking about them. It is difficult sometimes for us, I think, not to lapse into the language of subsection 3 and clause this and paragraph that and so on, and I'm sure I do that far too often, but we do try and bring it back to the sort of central intent and purpose of the legislation and the change. So I'll just say a little bit about the content. You may have, if you've seen the white paper, you'll be familiar with some of this. 3 broad areas, and then a set of fairly discrete sort of items. So integration, principally around the statutory formation of ICSs, and some of the kind of duties and structures that help to sort of reinforce ICSs, bringing together both health partners within an integrated care body, but also sort of health and care and other partners in a partnership that sits alongside that. And then alongside that, a set of measures to do with reducing bureaucracy, I think, is the framing we've used in the white paper, changing in the light of the NHS England sort of initial proposals, the way in which procurement works, so that there is more flexibility for NHS commissioners to make decisions in a sort of proportionate way, and a number of other specific measures that relate to that. And then measures around accountability, partly to do with the national architecture as we bring together the component parts of NHS England and improvement into a single body, sort of reshaping a little the accountability relationship with government, changing the way the mandate operates, allowing it to run over a longer period, for example, and 1 or 2 other measures as well. And then quite a few other things which are sort of discrete measures, but which will also be important as we go through Parliament. Things around public health, to do with advertising and obesity, things around social care, to do with assurance and data and payments, and things like hospital food standards, and a number of other things. I won't try and list them all because I don't want to use too much time sort of getting into that detail, and we can perhaps pick it up later. So I suppose I'd just go back to sort of where I started, which is the importance of the legislative process serving the wider process of real world change. And we've tried to be proportionate in the way that we've both thought about and talked about legislation in that context. We think it can do some good. It can be enabling. We think it can be, supportive if it goes in with the grain of the system and the things that the system is discovering and improving on. But we wouldn't want to kind of overclaim beyond that. And hopefully, if we can retain a sort of strong alignment between what we're trying to do and what you're trying to do, we will produce something which is genuinely helpful. That's my great hope. But perhaps we can debate that as we go on, and I'll hand back to Chris.
Thanks, Jason. That's really helpful and really useful perspective. So, Michael, do you want to give us a sense of what it looks like from a lawyer's perspective?
Yes, thank you very much, Chris. So I can't yet do all the subsection this, Schedule 2 A, B for that, because they haven't published the bill. So a session on legislative change coming forth is necessarily focused on the white paper proposals. And I was invited to discuss what I suppose Donald Rumsfeld would call the known knowns and the associated known unknowns of the forthcoming legislative reform, or to put it another way, to introduce and talk about some of the bits that Hempsons clients are looking for clarity on and hope to get clarity on as these proposals develop. So I'm going to briefly touch on the intentions behind the reform. I think that was story one that we've already had. Skip as fast as I can past some politics, discuss the new ICS bodies, decision making and some potential conflicts. Despite all that, I'm going to confirm that it's not all doom and gloom from my perspective or from a legal perspective. I think everyone is aware that the existing legislative structures behind current provision are simply not designed for what is expected of providers or commissioners anymore. Policy and practice has rather moved on, not just on, but very far from what the law was originally set out and intending to achieve. This has caused its own ambiguities and difficulties, usually called or cited as workarounds that various lawyers and bodies have come up with to achieve what STPs and then ICS structures have been created and have worked. These structures are trying to deal with the fairly obvious and fairly well ventilated problems of capital backlogs, workforce issues, disparate data and information solutions. In fact, we've been ventilating them for longer than the long-term plan, but I did a conference on a similar topics to today at the publication of the 5-year forward view. That was 7 years ago. Doesn't time fly? The more concrete developments in the white paper and the Queen's speech have given us a few bits that we do know. The first, I suppose, non-surprise is the anticipated greater powers for the Secretary of State. The ability to give directions, call in reconfiguration decisions. I think the abolition of the IRP process, abolition and transferring of functions from arm's length bodies, it's all very high politics indeed, but will have practical implications, I think. The interest for ICSs and the interest in the bill will be, and where we'll need clarity, and part of this session is asking for where we would like clarity, is when or if the Secretary of State is going to intervene in what are often very difficult decisions, for instance, in decommissioning or reconfigurations. The current, I suppose, first unknown, and perhaps unknowable long-term consequence of the proposed legislation will be the increased, or potential increased, politicisation at a national level of NHS decision-making on local clinical services. I'm not even beginning to think that this has ever been politics-free, but a potential long-term consequence, and the detail at the moment is quite thin on how these powers are likely to be exercised. I have to admit it was a surprise to me, if not to everyone, was the proposal of the creation of the two ICS bodies. We've just described that hopefully removing bureaucracy is part of the process of this bill, and the much heralded 42 integrated care systems has suddenly, to me, become 84 ICS bodies, with what I see as some additional complexities and adding some new unknowns at this stage. As I think everyone will be aware, there's no set blueprint for what an ICS, current ICS structures should be or are, and the very permissive approach to date means that there's very significant differences in sizes and arrangements that are in place. Substantial differences in size and area, and what's sometimes called maturity of the systems. As we'll be hearing from Dame Gillian shortly from Gloucestershire as one of the first ICSs, it'll be interesting to hear their perspective on how the legislative risks and challenges will work on a more mature ICS. As this session is focused on what should be asked, the question really is the one-size-fits-all timetable that's being proposed achievable? The Big Bang approach has been endorsed again with no reason for delay has been stated by ministers. Is the question, is there any possibility of flexibility in the implementation timetable to reflect differences and substantial differences between the various ICSs and the parts of the country which are at very different starting points? Between the two new bodies, the ICS NHS body and the ICS Health and Care Partnership, although we've got some clarity on who will be on the boards, again, the permissive stance adopted to date of very locally determined membership of these, I suppose the overall risk is that whilst we broadly know what the functions of the two bodies are going to be at the moment, the specific governance and functions and accountability and how this sits and rests within systems, how the sort of diarchy will function, is one of the biggest concerns. Is are we going to generate a lack of accountability or gaps in accountability? The broad thrust and the anticipation of the bill from the white paper is that the legislative changes will be very permissive on form and structure. From reading it through, as all the lawyers in all the firms in this area did, we all noted just how many references there were to future guidance to be issued. It seems very probable that the bill will be very, very permissive in what will happen. Obviously, I'm going to be proven wrong in a few weeks when it gets published, but it seems very likely it'll be permissive. And then guidance will come out. And the real question is, how permissive or directory is that guidance going to be? It's because this could lead to very different approaches and very different structures being developed in different parts of the country. That might suit local circumstance, but the real question is, what is right, and is it going to be permitted, and is national guidance going to accept it? I suppose that the other point in all of this is ICS is sitting above, and as I called it, the diarchy at the top. There isn't really a good answer yet for where activities sit in the level within ICSs, from systems to place to neighbourhood. The exact division of roles and responsibilities between ICSs and their constituent places and parts remains something where additional guidance or indeed additional legislative input may be helpful. So the white paper makes it very clear that place-based partnerships are going to be a central part of the ICSs, but these are not going to be given any legislative basis. So local place-based systems will be free to continue their own developments, which will lead to the sort of collaborative, provide a collaborative level and joint decision making. And the legislative change to allow joint decision making certainly brings opportunities and also risks. The always mentioned possibility of being outvoted or bound by decisions of others sits somewhat uneasily with the legislative duties and functions of trusts being broadly as they are, with their own duty to put forward their own individual organisation and to ensure that the stability in finances and so forth individually compared to the collaborative good. So the main sort of thrust of gap of known unknowns, of questions of legal accountability and responsibility, which have been circulating since the 5-year forward view and the creation of ICSs as collaborative, not underpinned by statutory bodies, still remain. And under these proposals at present, it's still unclear where NHS bodies and providers will find themselves facing potential liabilities from other bodies, local authorities, or wider partners should the pathways in which these ICSs are governing fail to deliver. As I said at the start, I'm sort of scampering through, and given 7 minutes, so there's a lot I can't touch on. But I think from a legal perspective, it's really not all doom and gloom. Putting the ICS structures onto a statutory footing, tidying up the realities such as the combination of NHS England Monitor and the Trust Development Authority, and the promised further guidance on multiple areas, I think are very much to be welcomed. I think one of the more promising aspects of the white paper was the reality that local cooperation is driven, and local results and patient improvements are driven more by trust relationships and patient needs than legislation and contracts. So it seems broadly that this legislative reform is to be welcomed, but as lawyers too often say, the devil will probably be in the details. So we'll perhaps return to some of the details in the questions and the debate.
Thanks, Michael. That was really, really helpful. And having actually kind of spent a lot of time on the bill over the last, couple of months, it's just really interesting hearing that kind of sort of dispassionate, stand back legal kind of perspective. And I found it really, really useful. And a lot of what you said resonated with me. So if we've kind of got what might be in it, what's the legal perspective, then we've asked Jill, as I said, our much loved former chair, to basically, who's now chairing the ICS in Gloucestershire, to give her sense of what does it look like in terms of from the ground. So Jill, what's your view?
Thank you very much. And I'm much happier with former chair rather than old chair. So thank you for that correction. Gloucestershire is one of the initial ICSs. We were one of the first established. But I want to start with a couple of secrets. The biggest secret is when you've seen one ICS, you've seen one ICS. The second secret is that this is the first bit of legislation in my lifetime where it's been trying to legislate for difference. Every other time we've been through some sort of structural change, there has been something, whether it's geographical, population served or whatever, which has driven conformity and has allowed the sorts of things that do to look the same from place to place. If you compare what's now happening on the ICS issue, there are 42 ICSs ranging in size from, I think, Cornwall's the smallest at about 500,000, as is Somerset. Gloucestershire, we're about 650,000, up to populations of 10 million. We are not the same. We're going to have different abilities to do things, and we're going to have a different focus. If you look at Gloucestershire, our focus, because we're small, we're one-to-one relationships, is going to be on what can we do below place, below Gloucestershire. What can we unleash at local community and neighbourhood with our second tier authorities and our PCNs? If on the other hand, you're sat in a very large ICS, your focus is going to be on some of those intractable problems that face the NHS and NHS delivery, as well as trying to protect some of the stuff which is about longer term issues like inequalities in health. And that makes it a very difficult environment, both to legislate and to issue guidance. And I really want to give credit to the people in the Department of Health who started off a conversation about flexibility and have done their best, despite all the siren voices that happen during the time you're writing these things, but have genuinely tried their best to keep and enshrine flexibility on the face of the bill, so that the things that look different can be developed and affected by what the right things are for local communities and local systems and local partners. So I'm not going to talk a lot about what do we want from the bill, other than to say less is actually more if you genuinely want the flexibility that you're trying to unleash. But I want to talk more about the environment and what happens with some of the guidance that's being issued. Because whilst the legislation sets the legal framework and all of that sort of stuff, most of the things we'll be affected by on a day-to-day basis will come through guidance issued by NHSE and by other external regulators. I did want to just briefly, though, comment on this issue for central control and as exercised through the Secretary of State. Because whilst Jason's talked about that being an issue in terms of reconfiguration and the potential downside, potentially upside of that, there's one other thing that the Secretary of State has said that he personally wants to be involved in, and this is possibly one of the most important issues. He wants to sign off the senior appointments in ICSs. Now, at the very best, that could be a recognition that the department has more involvement, and it could be a very permissive thing, taking the views of local stakeholders and regional offices. On the other hand, in the particular political environment we find ourselves at the moment, that could be a recipe for more people who are seen as politically of the right persuasion. That in normal times wouldn't be a problem, but it could potentially be a problem in that much of the development of ICSs against the timescale that we're working on is being driven by the people who sit there today, and many of those have got very particular views how to do it in their own community. And if come October we have a sudden change of all the key players, we could fundamentally find ourselves in some very difficult situations where things which have made sense to partners don't make sense on a macro political basis. So I think that's a really important nub that's around at the moment. So what are we pushing for and trying to strive for in terms of the guidance? Well, we're trying to push the NHS England and improvement to mirror the flexibility that's been shown thus far in the Department of Health, so that we get flexibility to get the right structures dependent on our own circumstances. So what we would want to do in Gloucestershire, which would intimately involve our providers, because we see ourselves as one and the same, we see ourselves as having the common goal, we serve the same population, we don't see inherent conflicts other than the conflicts that exist when you take slightly different perspectives on patient groups. But what we want to do would be very different if you were sitting in one of these very large organizations, where you're not going to be able to do what we will do, is have everybody around the table. You're going to have to work through intermediate mechanisms such as provider collaboratives. And the amount of flexibility in what's being written for the guidance, I think, is going to set the agenda for us rather than the full legality. So it's very hard if you're sat at NHS England, because they're being lobbied all the time. They're being lobbied by the anarchic wing of the ICSs, which say, leave us alone, let us do everything we want to. But they have an equal weight they have to give to people who are saying, actually, in our environment, this is harder. And we need more clarity and more guidance about what that means. We can't make it work with the nature of the relationships and the scale of the relationships with that degree of ambiguity. And I would say we're about a third keep it ambiguous, a third a little more guidance, and a third saying, well, you know, we've lived here before, just bring it on. So the quantity of guidance as well as the nature of the guidance will be very important. And if I just say, the last document I saw on provider collaboratives was its almost last draft, 185 pages. And every page gives you the opportunity, and every word gives you the opportunity for more ambiguity and confusion. You can see that we're a long way away in the guidance from having the degree of flexibility that would allow every community to get what they feel is right for them. So the second set of issues that I think are really important for ICSs, and I'm a passionate supporter of ICSs. I was originally a public health physician, so to have something that talks about determinants of health, inequality, alongside good, effective and safe health services is music to my ears. That's what we should have always been doing. But there's a little bit of, I think, strange speak going on at the moment, that in many places, if you read what's being written, there's a sort of suggestion that all the ICS will do is talk about those long-term determinants of health. Whereas you know as well as I do that the majority of the pressure on the ICS and the local community is going to come because of how we manage recovery. Good and effective ICSs should make that recovery conversation better, not because everything's a system problem, because most things belong to individual organisations, but for those things that are genuinely system, we ought to have a different way of having and managing that dialogue that actually takes us forward. And it's really important as we move to this new world that we talk about not just this accountability framework which comes from NHS England, the regional office, the ICS, but we also talk about the importance of shrining good and effective trust leadership. Because if we don't have good and effective trust leadership who feel accountable for their own organisations and for delivering the business and for making sure the quality is good, then actually not only that organisation will fail, but so will the ICS. And currently, too much of the conversation is about You know, the cartoon of 3 huskies up front, you know, beavering away, and 24 regulators sat in the trough of the sleigh, being pulled along by a small number of people who get the work. And it feels a bit like that at the moment, with insufficient reflection and respect for what must and has to go on within individual organisations in the best possible way. So finally, success for the ICS becomes something that has to be measured in new and different ways. A lot of people were very surprised by the 2 committees, and the big challenge around the 2 committees is to find the metrics that are appropriate for those 2 groups, so that they are not puddling in each other's territory and adding confusion. Again, we're very lucky in Gloucestershire, one-to-one relationship. We are able to have genuine conversations about how do we minimise bureaucracy by thinking about the Health and Wellbeing Committee and the Partnership Committee, and what can we do either as a committee in common or as a single new entity which actually does both pieces of this jigsaw. But if you're sat in many places where your experience of local authorities are, somebody was talking in a previous meeting today about they have 3 unitary authorities united in hatred. How can you get meaningful work in a single committee? And how do you prevent those committees becoming totally focused on the delivery of healthcare in their patches? Because that's important to councillors as well as the long-term deliverables. So what we want, and I think it's really important we keep pressing for, is enough flexibility and an expectation that we can explain how we will do things, but not telling us how that should be. The more people from the centre try to tell us how to do it and who must sit around the table, the less we'll be able to unleash the possibilities for invention, innovation, flexibility and agility, which is, I think, what's made the NHS so successful during the COVID outbreak. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. That's really, really helpful and a very useful perspective. So if you could start, if you've got some questions you'd like to ask, we've already got 2 sitting in the box. That would be really helpful. I'm going to start by asking Jason to just pick up 3 of the things that Michael raised, and I think Gillian also raised them as well. So just a little bit of a perspective, Jason, around powers of direction, reconfiguration power, Henry VIII powers, the relationship between the Secretary of State and the NHS. And I think the worry that Michael expressed about increased politicisation, given that Jill and Mike both mentioned it, useful to get your view on these kind of 2 different ICS kind of bodies and how you envisage that working. And then I thought Michael posted a really interesting question about actually uniformity of timetable, just a sense of what you think the implementation kind of might look like. So just to say, Jason, that I don't want to put you in a difficult position. So if you want to kind of duck, then please duck and nobody will think the worst of it.
Thanks, Chris. And yeah, no, they're all good questions. I think on the powers, I mean, I hope you don't think this is ducking, but I think a lot will come down to how they are used. I mean, I've been in the department for, gosh, nearly 20 years now, and I've seen different ways of kind of managing that interface between national leadership, politicians, government, parliament, and the system, and they all have their pros and cons, and they all, in the end, often come down to the quality of the relationships and the quality of the information flows between the different bits of the system, as much as any powers. I think as I said earlier, the common theme that runs through all of this is flexibility, and I think that operates as a principle at all levels, and that that, if you follow the logic of that through, that does mean being able to do things at different levels of the system to deal with issues as they arise. That doesn't mean that the norm of the system becomes using some of those mechanisms, just as the norm of the system at the moment isn't for, let's say, Monitor to spend its time sort of intervening on a sort of daily basis, but it's there because there is that possibility that it might be needed. So I think that the proof of the pudding will be slightly in the using, but the problems and the kind of the interfaces in the system that we've been familiar with will probably be a reasonable guide to the future as well as the past. So I'll probably leave it there on that one. On the two bodies, I think Jill has in some ways led us to the answer a bit on that one, because when we went through the process with NHS England and with others in the system of trying to think through how we would legislate for all of this, we spent this was probably, it's one of the most interesting processes I've been involved in, and I definitely ended up thinking a different thing at the end that I thought at the beginning. We did think we began with a strong assumption we would go for a single body, and we'd try and sort of bring together the different elements of health and care, the local government, NHS, into a single framing. And we found that was very difficult because of the differential accountabilities between local government and the sort of national accountability structure for the NHS. And we wanted to retain, and this was a particular ask of the LGA and local government colleagues, we wanted to retain a space within which health and care, the NHS and local government could meet as equals. That was a really important sort of almost cultural point that was made. But on top of that, we also, and this goes to Jill's point about sort of, and actually Michael's point as well about differential development, we face, if you're going to take an asset-based approach to change rather than a blueprint-based approach where you sort of try and homogenize everyone into the same thing through some sort of regulatory or legislative mechanism, if you start from where people are, you have to accept that they start from different places. So if you legislate, you have to legislate with a degree of sort of elasticity and flex for how people then take forward what they have to do and what they can do, and sort of blend it into something that works for them. So that the partnership element of the ICS is probably the more flexible part of it. So the NHS board, the ICB, will contain some of the more formal functions that you would expect to see, for an accountable body, and then there will be options about how those two bodies sort of relate to each other, and that will be a matter of choice and shaping within the system. So inevitably that does generate a degree of kind of openness and possibility. We think, however, this is again where looking out into the system as we've done and seeing how people have done it already offers us some hope that actually you could either run these things almost as one together, as some systems I think have done and will do, and that's fine, or possibly develop them towards each other over time, if that's the point you're at, where you've perhaps got some of those differences of view that Jill was sort of talking about earlier. And I think we will see probably 3 or 4 models, would be my guess, emerging over time, and we're sort of already perhaps seeing 1 or 2 of them. And I think that's where we need to have really strong sharing and sort of a willingness to look laterally at peers to think about, what works in different systems, not to find the one that works or the single truth, but to find options and possibilities and opportunities for learning. So I think, and that goes a little bit to the third point, which is about timetables. I think there are 2 things here that you have to think about. One is, if you like, the sort of the point at which you need to do a legal switch if you're moving into a statutory body. And you have to do that in one go, really, and on a uniform basis. But then there is absolutely then, of course, a developmental process over time. And that goes to the different elements of the ICS. It goes to how the relationships are built, and all of that difficult stuff that cannot be just legislated into existence has to then be done. And I think we will not see. We'll see some places that are already doing that. We will see other places that will take time to get to that, and that won't happen when there's a legislative switchover.
Okay, thanks, Jason. So the way I'm going to do it is, please feel free, Michael and Jill, to pick up anything that's been said in terms of either a previous answer or people who spoke after you. But I'll also add a specific question. So, Michael, David Rogers, who is a very good friend of both Jill and I think is concerned about the multiplicity of the new bodies that are going to be created. And we have a bit of a statement that effectively, if you've got neighbourhoods, PCNs, neighbourhoods, trusts and foundation trusts, ICSs in their two-part form, places, provider collaboratives, and the NHS-EI region, does this not feel like it's going to be quite a crowded pitch, particularly if, for example, and this is how one chief executive put it to me the other day, there's a very big HR team at Skipton House at EI nationally. There's a big HR team at NHS EI regionally. There's a big HR team in the ICS. And I've also got a big HR team at my foundation trust. So could we end up with 4 thick layers that probably wouldn't be particularly helpful? Just give us your sense, because I think you raised it, Michael, about this kind of sense of how many different bodies we might have around.
I'm hoping you can hear me, because my has frozen, but I can still hear you. So if you could,
no, we can hear you absolutely fine, Michael.
I'm going to assume you can see me as well, so I won't do anything disturbing. So I think, yes, I think a point I've made in just about every presentation I've ever given is just that the NHS is phenomenally complex in its operations. I know it's always in the mindset of the media and all that, it's always just the NHS, but just describing, PCNs doesn't even describe the multiplicity of practices that form the PCN. We haven't even got onto ophthalmy, we haven't got into dentistry, which has never really been part of these ICSs, STPs, or anything else really. It's been kept apart. So the complexity in operations, I think the reality is for providers and boards is that the provider collaboratives having its own board, having place and neighbourhood involvements, dual membership boards, I think there is a risk of a new era of cooperation could result in an era dominated by paperwork and management. When I was speaking to, I don't have consent to say who, but when I speak to an ICS an individual earlier this week, it was quite pithily put to me that there was a potential of individuals getting rather bored of boards, in that they'd be constantly attending various institutions, organizations, collaboratives, forums, alliances, all with the intention of improving patient life, but probably generating more minutes than actions. So yes, I think there is a risk of that at the start, but I think these things will settle down as the ICSs mature into what is actually working in each area. So I both not answered and answered.
Thank you, Michael. So Jill, I'd be interested in your kind of reflection on the potential crowded pitch. There's also a fantastic question that's been asked just for you, which effectively is from Geeta Patel, who says, is the touchstone for this about outcomes for patients and users, and the structure's merely a means to that end? And should people be judged on that? And I know, because it's a cause very close to your heart, that you share the concern that in this focus on governance, accountabilities, structures, ICBs, ICPs, places, etc., that actually we just forget the focus on, particularly in the setup phase, we forget the focus on patients and service users.
Yes. Okay. If we don't get this right, it's going to be a nightmare. And I, for one, am not spending my life going in and out of meetings. I will just go completely potty. So how are we thinking about it? Well, what we're trying to think about is actually subsidiarity. We might have to have meetings. We might have to have structures. But if they're not dealing with inappropriate things and they become valuable because they know quite clearly what they're dealing with, then actually it's not as nightmarish. The nightmare scenario is everybody thinks everybody's accountable for everything, and all of the conversations go on in multiple places, and then we get into what's already happening. Whose decisions are more important? If we take a decision at the ICS and one of our trusts doesn't like it, who is in prime position? Once that happens, then we'll just go around chewing our own tails for months. So we're working really hard about subsidiarity, and we work on the basis that actually if you're interested in patients or whatever, 80% plus of that is going to continue to go on in institutions and structures. And we should only be taking things out of those if there is a genuine reason it needs a different and a more collaborative approach. So obviously, if you're talking about flow through a hospital and it's not working, that becomes a partnership issue. But if you're talking about A&E performance because you're under-doctored, that's a trust issue. So what we need is an agreement between each of the layers about what comes up and what gets pushed out. And you know as well as I do, this needs a self-deny ordinance, because we all want to get involved in the things that the lower tier, you know, lower is the wrong word, but the tier that does the business can resolve, because that's our comfort zone. And we all don't want to tackle the really difficult things that only our level can tackle, because that's a nasty, difficult zone. And I only have to quote social service, social care as being a classic example where problems are dealt with locally because the only people who can resolve it won't resolve it because it's politically a nightmare and really complex. So for us, it's all about subsidiarity, agreement who does what, and the style and how you do that. And I think that will, over time, reduce the meetings. In terms of things like health and wellbeing boards, that it seems to me there are three simple answers. You do it as all one group and you all come together. And that's how we've worked over the last few years. Twice a year, we go into big partnership stuff. 10 times a year, we do the stuff which is the bread and butter of the NHS. And that's worked perfectly well. But I think we're going to go to something where we have a joint committee, which is both health and wellbeing and the ICS, which is how it should be, and we'll have joint chairs. So actually, we can do NHSE type stuff if we chose to. We can do health and wellbeing. We can influence the longer term agenda of employment and the stuff like that. They can influence some of the stuff that goes on. And for us, that works perfectly. It's much more complicated if you sit in a place with multiple local authorities and large numbers of trusts. So if I were sitting in a trust, what I would be trying to do is get this agreement of what is my business, what are the escalation rules, and where do we escalate it? And that becomes very important when you're dealing with what is ICS business and what is regional office business. When does the regional office work with individual trusts? When do they work with the ICS? And we know some regions have got the view that the new role of the regional office is to sit in a room with the ICS leaders and wiggle their finger and say, you've had 30 minutes and you haven't resolved this intractable problem that we failed to resolve for 20 years. That's their way of working, where others are talking about a much more dynamic way of actually embedding staff in the ICS. So you do it once and you can get that balance right. So if I were a provider, that's what I'd be pushing on. Clarity about my business and clarity about your business.
Thanks, Jill. Really helpful. And I've been a poor chair and said to people that if they could put their observations in the Q&A box as opposed to the chat one. And sorry, Sue and Andy, for failing to say that. But you've both raised, Sue and Andy, in the chat some actually a quite important couple of important points which we should pick up, which effectively are the nervousness that the crowded football pitch is going to basically mean that a lot of individual senior leaders' time is going to be spent actually servicing this, structure that may result. And also, secondly, again, I think, Jill, you've just mentioned it in terms of, what is the appropriate role for the region? And it's certainly something, Andy, that we've been pushing for, which effectively is how much would you expect the region to delegate down to ICSs if they're going to play the first layer, as it were, of assurance and oversight. So if when I come to you, and I think we've probably got time for one more round in terms of going round between all of you, if you want to pick Jason, Michael and Jill, pick up those comments, that would be quite interesting. The other one I think that that Sedi's asked, which I think is a particularly interesting one, and it goes back in a sense to Geeta's question, is actually, how do we think that ICSs are really, and the changes that we're going to put in place are going to move the dial on population health and health inequalities to deliver the outcomes that everyone talks about? So Jason, you've said very persuasively on a number of different occasions, let's kind of not lose the focus on what we're actually kind of trying to do here. What's your sense of how that's actually going to work in practice?
I suppose my view would be on the shift to population health. It's a mix of what I detect a kind of recognition that the demography drives you that way. There is a reality to this that isn't just a sort of, if you like, a kind of framing or a management framing, or which we kind of sometimes swing between. So that helps. I think the other thing that the structures that do is sort of encourage partners towards the logic of working together, but they absolutely don't. You will not drive this through legislation and guidance. I mean, I think the thing I probably set most store by is the development of peer learning, and sort of a kind of a recognition that there's an answer somewhere. It just may not be here. And again, I don't think government is going to necessarily or should try to drive that, but I think we should definitely be mindful of allowing that to take up a space that we don't intrude on too much, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, how about, Jason, just give us one reflection on, I think one of the things that Jill has been raising consistently throughout this session, which absolutely resonates with me, is the different size and geographic footprint and effectively the different dynamics that brings. And I think, she was absolutely kind of spot on in terms of, the solution that is likely to work in Gloucestershire, which I thought, again, her neat solution of, how they were coming together with the Health and Wellbeing Board clearly is not going to work in a place like, let's say in the Northeast or Merseyside and Cheshire that have got very large kind of numbers of, of local authorities. So just tell us a bit of a sense about how the department is thinking about this issue of different size of geographic footprints.
Yeah, it's striking, isn't it? There are some pretty broad differences in not just numbers of people, but also sort of geographies and types of population and the sorts of services that apply in different contexts. And I think this is where having alongside the sort of written bits of the legislation, if you like, the defined bits, what the ICB will do and so on, and some of the unwritten things, as I think Michael's picking up on, we're not looking to legislate for what a place is. I think that the drafters would thank us for not trying to do that. And so I think you will end up with some, and we are ending up with some geographies where things are happening at different levels in different ways. And again, I think there is, we need to kind of build out from what people have already done rather than try and homogenize too much, but also be the logic of that is you then are really attentive to what's happening and what we might learn from that. I don't mean from the centre necessarily, but laterally, so that you can apply. As I said before, I suspect 3 or 4 models will emerge. Some of them might be tied to scale. There might be a sort of almost like a prototypical big ICS and a sort of a smaller one that emerges, and some of the smaller ones might be models for places within some of the bigger ICSs. And I guess we should, there's a bureaucratic tidiness instinct that might want you to then make them all sort of similar. But I think if they work, and we're getting, as one of the comments said or one of the questions said, if we're getting to the outcomes we want, then I think we go with it.
Okay, Michael, I'm going to come to you next, and then Jill, I'll give you the last word. Michael.
It's difficult to sort of to see how it's all going to end up with all the different size things. The tendency of the NHS from the centre to impose, after a while, centre-based guidance that restricts actions may occur and be disruptive in these different organisations where we've got some systems which have places the size of the Gloucestershire system in difference in size. And if the centre, it's a highlighted risk pointed out by Jill, was what works there won't work everywhere. But if the centre tries to impose uniformity or uniformity of approach, or does this down the line, it could be very disruptive. Ultimately, this is the terminology from sort of the contracts lawyer in me is we're looking for an outcomes focused rather than a prescriptive contract. And the problem with an outcomes focused is you want to say ICSs must improve, say, health inequalities, but not say how. But then the arguments are, what are those inequalities? And then suddenly someone wants to measure a different one than the one you're measuring, or measuring in a different way. I think it's interesting times is probably the best, is my point. And I look forward to assisting multiple parts at different layers as this goes along. Thanks,
Michael. Jill, I know you were keen to come in.
Yeah, I just want to say, Seti's put in the chat, the answer's leadership. Now, what's the question? And I think that's really important, and I couldn't believe it more strongly. A little bit of practical stuff. I'm part of the ICS chairs come together, and all life is in the ICS chairs, let alone their ICSs. You know, we vary completely from, I regard myself as the anarchist wing of structures. But what we've been talking about is there are some generalizable message which is apply everywhere, and there are some specific things which are about size, scale, complexity, and all of those things. And that what we need between the overall learning, because at the moment we cluster together for warmth and all of those other things, but actually what we need is a bit of focus learning where we put the Gloucestershire-like organisations together, of whom there are more than you think. And we also put the really big, Mongolia places together, who can have the sort of conversations about the complexity. And we ask them two things. One, what will work for you with your nature? So there's some peer learning. But then we ask and what's the generalizable question? Because the generalizable questions can actually be codified, whereas the specific answers run the risk of being the things that get codified, but they're my answer in my place. And that's not for codification. There's a way of influencing a lot of this, and people who aren't actively thinking about this is that ICSs are going to have constitutions, and their own constitutions can enshrine some of the stuff about how we do it around here. And there's an opportunity to shape that in conversation. And if everybody's dissatisfied with the constitution in a particular ICS, so the ICS and the providers and the council is probably not far off right, because there has to be some compromise to have something which takes the system on. The third thing I want to remind people of, and it's the get real thing, is ICSs have, I think, 3 issues they have to do, and a part-time issue at the moment, which is a time-bounded one. And the time-bounded one, and the most important thing, is they have to wind up CCGs safely. And we all know what happens when you don't do technocratic things safely. It'll bite you for years. So that's got to be done. But there are 3 time boundaries, and we've got to be realistic about them. I know we all discovered health inequalities, but I can promise you that 80% of what ICSs will be asked for the next 3 years will be about the delivery of acute mental health and community services. They will be technocratic health issues. And we need to have mechanisms that can handle that, because it's not going away. That is the political thing. And if you look at the Maury poll of what citizens want, they want their waiting list sorted, and ICSs have to help deliver that. But they earn 2 things by delivering that. Second is working in the now to the 5-year agenda, which is about the transformation of pathways. Because we know if we get the pathways right in different ways and they're clinically owned, we can get more bang for our bucks, better outcome, and we can begin the work of moving services closer to where people live in new and dynamic ways. And if you do that, so those are health service focused, that will give us the right in the long term to keep up the effort of delivering long-term transformation in the life experiences that individuals live. And that means having a legitimate say in economy, in education, in innovation, in imagination around your patch. Now, if the ICSs can manage that, and I bind it in time because I think it makes it easier for me to understand that I don't have to be doing inequalities every day, but I have to create a climate and culture where it can never be forgotten, then in 5 years' time, I'll sit in front of you. I will be old then, Chris, but I'll be a very happy bunny.
That's a great place to end, if I may say so. Can I, on your behalf, thank Jill, Michael and Jason for sharing their views and thoughts. Extremely kind of helpful. A very good debate, I thought. This one is going to run and run, and it's going to run, I suspect, for quite some time beyond the bill. But thank you very, very much indeed, all of you, and for your contributions, and then also for the audience for your questions, comments and attendance.